Hello and welcome to the Dropping in Surf Show. My name is Rob Case. I am a paddling technique coach located in Northern California. And today on this episode, we're going to talk about the respiratory system and specifically respiratory muscle training, whether we as surfers should use it. Is it going to be helpful for us? And we're going to dive into some of the studies that have been done on RMT, respiratory muscle training, and talk about in what instances might we use it, and what instances might we not use RMT. So wanted to cover a little bit about first what the respiratory pump is. How does it work at rest? How does it work during exercise? Does it ever fatigue? Is it something that is a part of our autonomic system that we're constantly using all the time to breathe, but can it be trained? Can it be improved? Then I'll go into kind of what respiratory muscle training really is, and how one might train the respiratory pump. Then I'll talk about some studies that were done to determine whether RMT was increased performance in athletes or not. And then I'll finally kind of round it out by explaining and concluding, does it relate to surfing? Can we use it for surfing? So hopefully I keep your attention during the whole thing. It's going to get kind of deep into some of the science, but hopefully it's interesting to you. So let's dive in. If you are watching on the screen, you'll see a diagram of the respiratory pump. And the way that we kind of talk about the different muscle groups that are involved in the respiratory pump is that there are inspiratory muscle groups that are being engaged, and there are expiratory muscle groups that are being engaged. And actually, when we talk about respiratory muscle training, we do break it up into inspiratory and expiratory training, and a combination of the two. In the early days, a lot of studies had a lot to do with inspiratory muscle training, basically you inhaling, and not so much around expiratory. And it had mostly to do with limitations in the way in which they would study it and measure it. But in more recent times, they've been able to study and measure both. And so we have a lot more data and information around whether or not it is helpful or not. But what we see on the screen here, for those of you that don't see the screen, I'll try to explain it. But it's basically a diagram of the human rib cage, all the way up into the neck, and down into the abdominal area. And on the left-hand side, it says inspiratory, and there's a couple different muscle groups that are outlined. There's scalenes and intercostals and sternocleidomatoids. I probably just butchered that one, but that's the muscles around the neck. And then down below is the abdominal rib cage, specifically the diaphragm. And that's all inspiratory muscle groups. Now, it doesn't mean that on the right side of your body are the inspiratory and on the left side of your body are the expiratory. It just is trying to split up and show you which ones are the inspiratory versus the expiratory muscle groups. So when you inhale, you're using these sternocleidomatoids, the scalenes, external intercostals, and the diaphragm. And when you exhale, you're using the internal intercostals, the external obliques, the rectus abdominis, transversus abdominis, and internal obliques. And so you have these different muscle groups that work actually when we inhale versus exhale, which was something that I actually was kind of an aha moment for me when I realized this, that, whoa, I thought they were the same muscle groups that helped me inhale versus exhale. But it kind of makes sense. Like when you're really breathing hard, you feel it more in your abdominal muscles when you're exhaling than when you're inhaling. And this just basically outlines and explains it. There's some really interesting kind of areas around this. I was pulling a bunch of different information. In this first article that I'm going to pull up, it really talks about what what is the respiratory pump made of. 3 different groups of respiratory muscles. There's the diaphragm, the rib cage muscles, and the abdominal muscles, which I just outlined. And they all kind of work hand in hand with each other. A couple of kind of key facts that I wanted to kind of point out was that when you're actually at rest, the diaphragm and inspiratory rib cages kind of coordinate activity. The inspiratory rib cage muscles, but normally no expiratory muscles are used when we're just kind of at rest, which I found really interesting. So the expiratory muscles that we outlined, they're really only used when you're exercising. And the inspiratory muscle groups are the ones that are used kind of all the time, no matter what. Another area that I wanted to kind of outline is like, how do these things work during exercise? And I'm going to just go down to a visual here, and I'll explain this a little bit more. So this visual shows kind of like kind of a heartbeat or a breath, inhalation, inspiratory lung volume or end inspiratory lung volume on the top, and expiratory lung volume on the bottom. And it's kind of like a range. And so there's a line that goes up into when you breathe in, and there's a line that goes down, and there's like a limit at the bottom when you exhale. So when you're at rest, that's the tidal volume, which is the distance between those two, is relatively the smallest, right? As you go into exercise, that tidal volume grows. So light exercise, the tidal volume starts to expand a little bit more. You start to breathe in a little bit more. You start to breathe out a little bit longer. When you get into modern exercise, moderate, you begin to expand it even more. And more so is that the frequency of inhale and exhalation increases. And so on the visual on the screen, you actually see the curves of the parabolic arc get closer and closer together. And then when you get into hard and very hard, it's probably the largest tidal volume that you see between the end expiratory and the end inspiratory lung volumes. But something really interesting happens once you get to your maximal exercise limits, is that the end expiratory lung volume doesn't expand anymore. So the inspiratory lung volume continues to expand. So you breathe in longer when you're at your maximum, but you don't breathe out as much. So let's just kind of do a gut check right there. Like, you guys have all been at this point where you're breathing super heavy and you're at maximum lung capacity, right? And when you're at that point, you're really trying to just like breathe in, but when you're exhaling, you kind of cut it off. You're like, and you're really trying to get more inhale than you are exhale at that point when you're at that maximum stage. And so, when we get to this point of maximal energy exercise, the reason why the end expiratory lung volume doesn't expand anymore has mostly to do with just the abdomen's capacity and limit, the volume that it can take, and the diaphragm is more unloaded and used as more of a flow generator, whereas the end inhalation can expand more because those abdomen muscles relax and you're using mostly the rib cage muscles contracting. So kind of an interesting take on why that curve kind of goes the way that it goes. And there's more in here that you can talk about or read on your own, but that's really all we kind of need to know about that. So when we get to these higher levels of exercise, up to that maximum, The pressures produced by the respiratory muscles are well below their maximum. But at maximal exercise, the oxygen consumed by those respiratory muscles to breathe is only about 10% of their total capacity, which I find like really amazing. Now, this is only true for healthy subjects that aren't trained athletes. So trained athletes and highly fit endurance athletes, the pressure produced by the inspiratory muscles can approach that maximum, and the expiratory pressures are increased to levels at which compression of the airways determines the expiratory flow limitation and not a physiological limitation. So at any rate, the more fit you are, the more that you can adjust these limitations. So that's kind of like the first thing that we need to know is that, oh, we can actually change this, and we certainly can through respiratory muscle training. So everything that I have found in the studies have pointed towards some sort of respiratory muscle training at increasing performance. And I'll go through some of the details, but they break it down into two areas: the inspiratory muscle endurance training, which is just you're working those muscles of breathing in, like and there's resistance against that. And the endurance training basically tests and trains how long you can continue to do that before they fatigue, because in studies they have actually shown that these muscle groups do in fact fatigue over a certain number of reps and a certain amount of time. And you can train that fatigue to happen less and less. As a side note, they also found there is a correlation between these muscle groups fatiguing and your limb muscles fatiguing. Now, that's a very important point to understand. So there is a correlation between the inspiratory and expiratory muscles fatiguing, or the time it takes them to fatigue, and the time it takes your limb muscles to fatigue, meaning your biceps or your legs. Now, physiologically, that's the case, but also perceptionally, that is the case. So there's actually two factors that come into play. It's when you perceive yourself being tired versus when your body is actually tired. So there's a mental game. There's a mental game as well. But in both instances, they've found a correlation, which I think is quite fascinating. And so my question is then, if we train these muscle groups, does that also help training the lactic acid buildup in our legs and our arms and our back and those sorts of muscle groups? And most have concluded that yes, those will affect it. So really, really interesting thing. So we have inspiratory muscle training, and then we have expiratory muscle training, both endurance and strength training. So there are different kinds of muscle training, and I'm not going to go into deep detail. Just know that there's endurance training, which is dealing with the length of time it takes for it to fatigue, and then there's the strength training, which is just the outright strength. It's kind of like just like a normal muscle. It's how many reps you can do. That's endurance versus what's your maximum strength, your max effort. How much weight can you lift? It's the same thing. And what I found actually was an interesting thing. Like, so does RMT, respiratory muscle training, increase performance? And the short answer is yes, it does. But how much does it? That's the other question. In what circumstances does it? I think the first question is, does one type of RMT increase performance more than another? Meaning, does endurance do better than strength training, or is strength training better than endurance? And so there was a study here that I'm going to go ahead and outline here. The effect of respiratory muscle training here, done in 2012. And this one, as I scroll down into this chart right here, this actually outlines all the different studies that have been done using respiratory muscle training. I say that like 20 times. It's insane. And the differences that they make between a control group. So the more to the right these bubbles are, the more of a difference it makes. So in percentage terms. And you can see that, RMET, which is respiratory muscle endurance training, and RMST, which is respiratory muscle strength training, that's really kind of what they were looking at. And then this INEX is a combination of both. And then so they have cycling, they have swimming, they have cycling, running, and swimming in this first one. And this is constant load tests. And you can see there's been huge differences and improvements in all of these studies, pretty large, up into the 20 to 40% range for constant load tests with both types of training, more so with endurance training than with strength training in general. With time trials, in terms of performance, you can see that the improvement's not all that much better, or really, it's not that much. It's in the maybe 0 to 10% range, kind of averaging in the 5% improvement using this training over a control group. I'm not using the training for cycling, running, rowing, and some swimming studies as well. And you can see here that the strength training is a little bit inferior to the endurance training with, the cycling. If you go cycle, and run to run, you can see kind of they're different studies, and so they may have been set up differently, that sort of thing. But those are for time trials. And then for intermittent incremental tests, they only did one for running, and there was only the strength training, the respiratory muscle strength training, and that's in the 10% zone. And then finally, the incremental tests, which I think are probably the most important to kind of take a look at here. Incremental tests are some of the tests that were run that I've read about more so, and that's when they incrementally increase the level of effort that you're working on. And so it really challenges both endurance and strength. And here's the interesting part about it. You would think that the respiratory muscle endurance training for cycling and running would be better than the strength training. But in fact, if you look at kind of the averages, the strength training overall had higher averages than the endurance training for respiratory muscle training. Now, not by much, and it was specific to cycling. Cycling kind of pulled that average up versus running. And running was not so great with the endurance training and not super great with the cycle training. But with the strength, the respiratory muscle strength training, the cycling was up in the 30% improvement zone, depending on the level of effort that they outlined. And the different studies that they did. So this was just kind of this is an introduction into, yes, this kind of training helps. Which one's better? I would say that generally the respiratory muscle strength training has more evidence towards it improving performance levels in different levels of effort. And there are certain other areas that you may test that you can define performance as. But in terms of kind of what we might use it for when you're building your effort from rest to moderate to, to hard to severe to challenging to maximum, that's what we're talking about, is when we're changing from one area to the next. So I think that was it on that study. Yeah, that was it for that study. When we go into this study here, which was done in 2010, this is another study that showed a few more interesting outlines. So basically, this one I think I got the most from because it had most data. The two common types of RMT, they were saying they don't really differ too much in their effect. whereas the combination of inspiratory and expiratory strength training might be superior to everything else. This study right here is talking about really the inspiratory muscle training specifically. So it was a little bit older, but there's a couple really interesting pieces here, and I'm just going to zoom in on a few of these tables. Okay, so when we look at the moderate intensity exercise, you can see there's not that much difference between the pre and the post for the control, nor for the inspiratory muscle training group. The end exercise went from 1.5 to 1.56 VO2 liters per minute, and the baseline went from 0.93 to 0.94. So not much change there. The control didn't change all that much; actually went down. But for the severe intensity exercise, this is where we start to see some bigger differences. We start to see the baseline go from 0.6 to 0.4. Again, baseline is just kind of the start. At 360 seconds, the VO2 goes from 3.32 to 3.37 for the IMT group. And for the control, it does go up. It goes 3.17 to 3.2. The percentage for the IMT has gone up more than the control at that point. And then the VO2 at exhaustion for the severe intensity exercise went from 3.42 to 3.47, whereas the control group went from 3.25 to 3.28. Again, the difference being larger with the IMT group. So one could say that, when it comes to moderate versus severe, there's not much difference between the two groups with moderate intensity exercise. But as soon as you get into severe intensity exercises, the inspiratory muscle training has shown here to improve the VO2 oxygen intake or uptake, I should say, more so than the control group. So then we get into the maximum intensity exercise, and you see it go up even more. So the baseline has a large difference, and the control group, it actually went down. At 120 seconds, the VO2 went from 3.31 to 3.41 in the inspiratory muscle training group, and went 3.34 to 3.35 in the control. It almost didn't change at all, right? So that's a huge difference right there. And then once they reach exhaustion, you're looking at an increase in the inspiratory muscle training from 3.42 to 3.61, whereas in the control group, 3.44 to 3.48, once again, barely changing compared to the inspiratory muscle training group, which changed vastly. So what I like about this study is it really shows you the significant increases of inspiratory muscle training when the intensity of the exercise changes. When the intensity goes up, for example, the training makes a much stronger impact to the results in oxygen uptake, right? Now, here is more of a visual description of what I'm talking about. This first graphs, and now I'm showing some graphs. The top graph and the bottom graph, we're looking at IMT, so the inspiratory muscle training on the top graph, and the control group on the bottom graph. And there's not much difference. This is at moderate intensity work. You can see there's not much difference between the pre and the post. There's a little bit of a difference in the IMT pre-post. There's not much difference at all in the control. Then we go into severe intensity work rate graph, and you can see more of a difference now in the IMT pre and post. And again, not much different in the control. So this is just a visual representation of what we just talked about. Then when we finally get into the maximal work rate, I'll zoom in here, and you can see that the difference between IMT pre and post is much larger, and the difference in the control group is almost non-existent. The longer you go into the exercise time frame. So I found that actually really interesting. That just supports this kind of concept that it really has a lot to do with how intense the exercise is, whether the IMT and the EMT actually works, or the RMT, the respiratory muscle training works. A couple more statistics here: heart rate and blood lactate concentration. Remember, I talked to you earlier about how There has been a link in the studies between the respiratory muscle training and the fatigue or lactate that is generated in your muscle groups, in your limbs. And so this just shows you some differences in heart rates and blood lactate. Again, with the different intensity levels, so moderate intensity, severe intensity exercise, maximal intensity exercise. And you see the biggest changes in pre-post when you're doing inspiratory muscle training for the blood lactate mostly. And that's really the one that we're looking at, is the blood lactate. Heart rate, it's not that big of a change. But the blood lactate baselines and the change is much larger between the severe and the maximal, and it's not that much big of a change in moderate. So it further validates what we've been talking about so far. And then there's one more cool visual here in this training. This is why I like this one the most. So what we have here is A through C on the left-hand side here, A, B, and C show severe intensity, and then D, E, and F show maximal exercise intensity of different metrics. So the first one is maximum inspiratory pressure, and between pre and post has gone up in the severe. And it's actually gone up more in the severe than in the maximal for the IMT, the IMT versus the control group, essentially. So in the control group, it actually has gone down, but in the IMT, it's gone up. And in the severe, it's gone up, but just not as much as in the severe. So in terms of maximum inspiratory pressure, doing something more at a severe intensity level rather than a maximal improves your maximum inspiratory pressure more. When we get into the VO2 slow component and the time to exhalation, this is really interesting between the two. So you can see here with the inspiratory inspiratory muscle training on the left-hand side here has gone down, but in the severe, in the severe, it's gone down. When you look at that compared to when you look at the severe intensity VO2 slow component between the pre and post, it's gone down. But when you look at the maximal exercise inspiratory muscle fatigue, it's gone down dramatically more. So in terms of VO2 slow component, it's better at the maximum level. So again, this kind of training is much better. And then you have the control group that you can see there. It's gone down, but it barely moves. And then when we look at time to exhalation in seconds between the pre and post, you can see a much larger gap between the pre and post for IMT when it comes to time to exhalation in seconds for the severe intensity versus the maximal intensity. Just so once again, just kind of showing you the differences between those two. So the conclusion here is that, specific training of those inspiratory muscles increase the baseline maximum inspiratory pressure. It reduced inspiratory muscle fatigue and an enhanced VO2 dynamics and exercise tolerance during severe and maximal intensity exercises. So really, again, just more support around this kind of training. Okay, so moving on to the next study that I wanted to show you guys. This was done in 2009 by Allison McConnell. And the main thing that I got from this one, I'll just give you a summary. But essentially the summary here was that there was a reciprocal relationship found between leg blood flow or muscular fatigue and the work of breathing. And that was actually found in 1997, she outlined. And this thing became known as the inspiratory muscle metaboreflex. was the term that was coined. I know that's a mouthful. But it's this inspiratory muscle metaboreflex, which basically is the stimulus for limb vasoconstriction, and a cardiovascular reflex originating within the inspiratory muscles. All it basically says is that your muscles, your limb muscles, are related to your inspiratory muscles. And this is still when they weren't working yet on the expiratory muscles, but in terms of the inspiratory support muscles linking towards your limb muscles, that's all this is saying. It's basically suggesting that inspiratory muscle training generates improvements in exercise tolerance through two main mechanisms, which are probably also interlinked. One was the attenuation of effort perception, which basically means that exercise feels easier after inspiratory muscle training. And the second mechanism is the modulation of the inspiratory muscle metaboreflex, leading to a preservation of limb blood flow during exercise, which basically means that your muscles work better. Your other muscles work better after IMT. So that's what basically she outlined here and provided quite a bit of evidence around that. Then I came across another study here in 2013, so a little bit later on, having to do with swimmers. And this one I found really interesting because all up until this point, it's been cycling, it's been rowing, it's been running. There's been some swimming studies, but not really a ton. And so these guys looked at it, respiratory muscle endurance training in swimmers, before and after group, and a control group. And there really wasn't that much difference. And they explained how with swimming, just the activity of swimming, you are training your expiratory control and your inspiratory control quite a bit, just naturally, because you only get to breathe when your head is above water, or when you turn your mouth above water and your nose above water, and you're exhaling the entire time, the rest of the time. And so there's almost like a embedded training in swimming. And so to add on external inspiratory and expiratory training, it wasn't that big of a difference. However, they did notice a difference when it came to competition swim times. So there wasn't that much of a difference in forced vital capacity, not a huge difference in forced vital capacity. The biggest difference, there wasn't even that much of a difference in the field swims between the 50 meter and the 200 meter swim times. And again, we're not looking at the absolute numbers here, but we're looking at the changes and yeah, there's, it actually got worse on the 50, with the RMT, with the respiratory muscle training, endurance training, than the control group. The control group, they went up a little bit. These guys went up a little bit. It's all relative to the percentage where they started. So yeah, okay, maybe the respiratory group was a little bit better, actually. Now I'm looking at it, 27.7 seconds versus 28.1 seconds after, for the RMT group, and 28.1 to 28.8 in the control group. So yeah, the percentage change was a little bit better on the 50 meter, but the 200 meter competition and 50 meter times for competition sometimes were the biggest changes. So the 50 meter competition time went from 27.4 down to 26.6 in the RMT group, and the control group barely went down. Basically the same, 27.8 to 27.6 seconds for the 50 meter. But the 200 meter was the biggest difference. 130.7 seconds in the RMT group the before, 125.5 in the after. That's a huge drop in a 200 meter swim. The control group went from 135.4 to 126.9. So both groups did certain training sessions, but the RMET group did training sessions and respiratory muscle endurance training. And so those were kind of the biggest differences. And then the chest expansion was the other largest difference. When they measured chest expansion, it was much larger in the respiratory muscle endurance training group as it was in the control group. But in the control group, actually, the muscle expansion went down, whereas the chest expansion went down. Chest expansion in the respiratory muscle group actually went up. So I thought that was pretty interesting that there really wasn't that big of a difference. But what they concluded from this that that in the 50 meter and the 200 meter trials, the effort perception improved with the RMET group, with the respiratory muscle endurance training group, and that it was a pretty good, effective tool to use for longer distance events. Overall, when they compared this with other swim studies, the improvement in performance did go up 3 to 4% using respiratory muscle training in swimming, as opposed to higher percentage changes in cycling and running and rowing. But in swimming, that was kind of the largest changes. It was about 3 and 4%. And they concluded that, or they're suggesting that, for the middle distances, like the 200 meter, maybe the 500 meter and the longer distance, but the 200 is considered the most the toughest event, because it's a sprint, but it's a sprint endurance event. Whereas the 50 meter, I can tell you right now through my own experience, with the 50 meter, your heart rate's going up, but it's more from adrenaline than anything else. In the 200 meter, your heart rate goes up and hits that maximal exercise effort, a huge deal. And then once you start doing the 500, you're kind of in that moderate to severe intensity up until the last maybe 100 meters, and then you start cranking out your effort. So the 200 meter, actually, this study really goes hand in hand with what we've seen before with those incremental levels. So I thought that was kind of interesting. They had already shown cycling and rowing and swimming, or cycling, running, and rowing improvements with RMT, but they hadn't really shown too much in swimmers. And here they basically concluded that it would definitely permit higher improvement than just training sessions alone in the 200 meter. And they didn't really conclude that around the 50 meter, even though there were some improvements. So that I found kind of interesting. Only a few more here, guys, and then I'll wrap up and get to how this relates to surfing. So this one was done, again, by Allison McConnell. This is in June of 2004. There's some cool stuff in here, but here's the one that I really thought was interesting. Was they did some studies between inspiratory muscle training and a control group, and they looked at the amount of recovery time needed in between repetitive sprint tests. So this I found really interesting, because you can clearly see the dominance that inspiratory muscle training has. And for those of you that don't see this, it is a huge delta between that and the control group in terms of the amount of recovery time difference from the relative to the baseline. So inspiratory muscle training recovery time becomes faster and faster, or it gives a larger and larger difference between the baseline the more repetitions you do. So the longer, the more intense, to the point of maximal intensity, just like what we've determined so far. Not only do your muscles fatigue less, but your recovery time is faster and faster and faster. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about different ways in which we're surfing and the different scenarios that we're in. Are there instances where you need your recovery time to be very quick? So like basketball, for example, you sprint down, you shoot, and you got to sprint back on defense. You need a very, very high level of recovery time, or a very, very low amount of time to recover so that you can maximally perform on defense. And so Kobe Bryant was actually really well known for that kind of training, where he would sprint and then rest, and then sprint again, and then rest. And his whole goal was to try to reduce the amount of time he needed before he felt like he could go again. So it was that perceived effort again. But physiologically, he was improving the more that he trained. Steph Curry is also known for this. I read an article where his trainer will have him do sprints, and then he'll lay down on his back, and his trainer will put a sandbag on his stomach so that he can control his breathing and his diaphragmatic breathing in between the sprints, right? So, but what is he training? He's training this. He's training his inspiratory, well, in that case, he's training his expiratory muscle groups. And so it's really fascinating to me how now we have all this evidence showing us that this helps. This will help in particular instances. Okay, so this will help in particular instances. I have one more study here, recent advancements. So this was done in 2018, and it was basically I just wanted to point this out that, yeah, those are older studies. This one in 2018, I know it's still old. It's not 2024, but it's a more recent study that it just confirms. It just basically says, yeah, RMT has been shown to be effective aid for sport performance, and it still does, right? So there was like an update to a lot of the stuff that we've already kind of been talking about. So that's all that's really saying at that point, is that it still is. That's what it's saying. It still is. So the big question is how does this all relate to surfing? Which level of exercise matches best with surfing? So when we think about surfing, I think what we need to think about is, for me, when I go out at different spots on different days and different conditions, there's definitely different levels of effort that are required. I would say like a long period, single swell long period fall day at Ocean Beach, San Francisco, even if it's 10 to 12 foot, is loads easier than a 6 to 8 foot day short to mid period 8 to 10 foot at Ocean Beach, because of the frequency of waves, the amount of lulls, the distance that you travel in your efficiency stroke versus your sprint strokes or your power strokes. And so the level of effort is much higher with the shorter period, even though it's smaller, but the shorter period swell event than with multiple swells in the water than a single swell long period with bigger waves. And so I think what we need to think about is conditions. We need to think about what sort of break we're surfing. Are we surfing a beach break versus a point break? I think that's a huge difference. I can go down to Santa Cruz and surf all day down there because you got the channel in most of the spots. They're mostly point breaks. Whereas at Ocean Beach, I might last 4 hours and then need to take a break, or 3 hours and need to take a break for a while before I can go out again. You go to the East Coast, you get shorter period swells. You go to the Gulf, much shorter period swells. You go to reef breaks where there's channels, much different. And so I think when in terms of kind of where you're surfing, try to match where you're surfing and the conditions that day that you're surfing with one of those intensity levels of those incremental tests that we talked about. So when we talk about moderate intensity, is RMT actually going to help you? Not really, right? If you only go out on moderate, like on kind of chill days, you surf San Onofre, super chill days, you don't really go out on major swells. You're not really bringing your heart rate up. You're not really working super hard on those types of days, even if you're catching a lot of waves. Which brings me to another point. I've only been talking about paddling, right? Paddling out and paddling around. But what about more surfing days? Like when I went to Waco and we started with like 7 people, and then we went to 6, and then people got injured and broke boards, and then we're down to 5, and then 4, and then finally at the last 20 minutes we only had 3 people in the pool, and they were throwing three waves a set every minute 30. So we'd all ride a wave, we'd have to hustle back to the takeoff zone, and then we'd ride the next set. And we had to do that for 20 minutes straight because we didn't want to waste any waves. Well, I'll tell you what, it wasn't the paddling that wore me out there, it was the riding. Because I was doing a lot of twisting. I was still leaning into my turns. I was trying to take advantage of every wave. And the bottom half of my body was exhausted. I had basically been surfed out from being on my feet so much. Same thing with my lakeside trips. When we go there and we ride the lakeside surf wave, that's, there's no paddling at all. And there's no pop-up at all. It's you just hop on your board and you do cutbacks all day. My body, when I do back-to-backs there, very tired. So that's the other thing is to think about is maybe not the length of the wave, but how active you are on the wave. Like when we go to Kelly's Surf Ranch, there are some people that get up and they just kind of stand there and they don't really do anything. And that doesn't really get you that exhausted. But if you're doing turn, tucking in the barrel, holding, coming out, doing another turn, that's a lot of activity. And so if you're doing wave after wave after wave, you get pretty exhausted that way too. So try to break up your activity, where you are, the type of break that you're surfing at, into the moderate, severe, and maximal effort intensities. And if you are consistently hitting that severe and maximal effort intensities where you surf, then respiratory muscle training will help you. So that, I think, like, if that's where you live and that's what you do all the time, great. If you're going on a surf trip, in which that could be the case, you're going from the moderate level and you're like, oh, I surf every day, but you surf moderately, moderate intensity every day, which is good, but let's say you've got a trip planned to go somewhere and it's going to be severe to maximal intensity, or it could be. You want to prepare for that. So I would use respiratory muscle training along with severe and maximal training combined, leading up to that trip. So surfing wouldn't do it. You'd have to do something like swimming, or you'd have to do it combined with running or rowing or cycling to get the benefits from it, because it's the combination of the exercise and the RMT. It's not just doing the RMT that's going to help you with it. It's the combination of the training and that. So really important that you do that. So let me provide I hope that kind of gives you some guidance in terms of how does it relate to surfing. Yeah, it certainly relates to surfing, but you have to be in that severe to maximal intensity in surfing. If you're not, you have to do supplemental activities for RMT to actually help you, respiratory muscle training to actually help you. So I'll suggest a couple different recommendations of devices that could help you. What was really interesting to me actually growing up, so when I was growing up, I played the saxophone. And when I played the saxophone, I realized that, I was doing expiratory muscle training by playing the saxophone. You take a breath in and then you control your diaphragm to blow out. And there weren't super high levels of resistance expelling air through this, but if I played an alto sax versus a tenor sax versus a baritone sax, certainly there was a difference in the amount of pressure that I had to blow in order to get a certain sound out. And it was kind of like a indirect way of doing this kind of training. Now, at the same time, I was also swimming and I was also running a lot as a kid. And so I was doing this kind of expiratory muscle training naturally. So if you're a wind instrument player and you still do that, just keep doing that. It's fun, right? It's more fun. Now, does it give you the different levels that a device might, like certain devices might? No, not necessarily, unless you're switching instruments, like I said. But it's any wind instrument. It could be trumpet, it could be trombone, saxophone, even flute, I believe. You're using your diaphragm with different levels of flute, but it's the amount of air that you're trying to have to blow through the instrument. So the bigger the instrument, the more pressure and the more intense the exercise will be. So that's kind of the fun way of doing it. I don't think it's the way that most people do it. I use a device called AeroFit, AIROFIT, and I combine it with their app. Their app has different exercises that you can do. And the numbers on the side of the AeroFit, one is for inhalation pressure and the other is for exhalation pressure. And so you can find workouts on their little app that are more keyed into swimming or running or rowing. And it walks you through, okay, set the AeroFit to the third level in inhalation and the fifth level in exhalation. And then you work on that. And it's quite good. And it tracks what you're doing and what you're blowing. You have to let your significant other know what you're doing when you're doing it, because they think you're struggling with breathing when you do it. It freaks my wife out every time I do it. And so I have to do it when she's not around most of the time. But I think that, based on the science and just anecdotally, I think that I've kind of always been doing this kind of training through swimming and through playing a wind instrument, that this helps me kind of continue it on when I'm not doing those other things. Do not, and I will warn you, do not do any sort of respiratory muscle training if you're also doing apnea training. Don't do them on the same day, because it is working the muscle just like a muscle. A muscle can strain if you do too much. So for AeroFit, I may do it 3 days a week, maybe 4 if I'm not really doing much, combined with, again, a certain exercise during the day. So, you can do this with a normal exercise. You can go do this and go paddle around. You can do this and go swim. You can do this and go bike or cycle or a row. But that's the one that I use. I don't get paid by them to say that I use it, so don't think that I'm trying to sell you anything. But do your own research on it, on which one. Another one I found on the marketplace that is out there is called Power Breathe, Power Breathe. And it's similar. It has, resistance levels. I don't know if it has an inhalation and exhalation difference. It looks a little bit more basic than AeroFit. But I've heard this one is another one that's big on it. Now, some certain cautions when using either of these kinds of devices. And they're all over the websites, but simple things like if you have abdominal surgery, don't use these. If you have hernia, don't use them. Asthma patients that have a low symptom perception suffer from frequent severe exacerbations or with an abnormally low perception of dyspnea. I sound like a drug commercial right now, right? But it's basically saying like, okay, don't use these things if you have these issues. A ruptured eardrum or a condition of the ear. Right now, I don't know if you can hear it, but I have a bit of a sinus infection. Don't use it if you have sinusitis, a cold, or a respiratory tract infection. Don't use it because it's the sinuses. It's so much pressure on your respiratory muscles, but if your sinuses and in the surrounding areas aren't healthy, you could be potentially hurting them. And then there's other issues around heart failure signs and symptoms using RMT and IMT. So just read up. Bottom line is to read up. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a kind of an overview of respiratory muscle training. I hope it answers the question whether surfers should use it. I hope it answers the question when we should use it, if we do choose to use it, and how often to use it. But certainly combine. This is just one other tool you guys can employ to help you with your surfing out in the water. Because if you are improving your respiratory muscles, your inspiratory and expiratory, and that alone helps you with your muscular fatigue and lactic acid buildup, then you have more energy to use when you're surfing. You can make better decisions. You just have more fun. So that's the bottom line. So I hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email. And until next time, I'll see you in the water.